Hello, this is Mikey with another After Effects tutorial. Let's talk about motion blur. Now, there's some easy ways to do this and some more difficult ways to do it that give you a little more control. And I want to show you a few different ways of creating motion blur, starting with the simplest and kind of going from there. So, obviously, the simplest one is just to turn on motion blur. Now, if you look right here, there's this little icon, and it looks like a, like a ball going, and there's a trail of other circles behind it. That is the motion blur. And when you turn that on, what it's going to do is it'll just turn on motion blur for that layer. And you can see what it does is it kind of blurs things as they move. They don't blur when they're not moving, just when they are moving. And so once we kind of understand what the process of motion blur is, then we can kind of recreate it and give it some more different options if we wanted to have a more stylized motion blur. So this is just the basic one. And if you want to make any sort of changes to it, you need to go into the composition settings and then into advanced, and then your shutter angle and shutter phase and things like that. That's where you change how this looks, right? So if we do this as, say, the shutter angle is a 360, then you can see there's more blur. All right. So that's your basic motion blur. Let's go on to some 3 more options of how to create this. Here we have, what I've done is I take that same movement that we had before, but I pre-comped it. So we can see in here, there's no actual position changing. So according to After Effects, this is just a video clip and there's no movement. It can't read any data in here. So if I turn on motion blur to this, it actually doesn't do anything because nothing's moving and the layer itself isn't moving. So there's another way of doing that. And that's with an effect. If we go down to effect time, then we have this CC force motion blur. And what that's doing is it's analyzing the pixels and it's creating a motion blur based off of that. And then you have these same shutter angle and phase and stuff like that we had in the other one. But what we can do, if we zoom in, you can see there's just a lot of copies. And if we lower that down for 2, well, we can kind of understand what these different things do. So if we bring this up to like 64, see it's very smooth. Bring it back down to 8, we can start to see the different things. Now what the shutter angle is doing is just imagine this is how far out the blur goes, is a way of doing it, right? And so the higher your shutter angle, the more blur you get, but you also have to have more blur samples in order to make it look smooth. Even at 64 samples, you can kind of see the lines there. And then this is going to start to get take a long time to render it out, right? So that's a little too much. That's force motion blur. Now those first 2 are ones that are pretty simple, quick and easy. Just kind of apply it really and don't have to do much. I want to show you 2 other ways of creating motion blur that have a lot more things you can do. And these are going to be stylized. You have to set them up. There's going to be some rigging. So let's take a look at that now. The first one, there's a lot, and I've already got it set up, and I'm going to show you not all of these things at once. But first, it's using the echo effect. And let me just reset it. So I've got this echo effect, and you can see what echo does is as it moves, it will kind of do that same movement, but back in time. There's an echo. And in these, we can say how many seconds do we want this to echo to happen. And right now it's negative 0.03. And I'm actually going to go negative 0.001, which is really close. And then how many echoes do we want? Let's give it 20 echoes. And then so what we have here is now it's creating kind of that blur the same way, but we have a little more control over what it looks like. So if we want to say, I want the starting and ending intensity, see that's starting to look more like a normal motion blur. We can also bring down the end so that as it goes through the echoes, it gets less and less, right? It fades out. So that's something you really can't do in the other way. Another fun thing we can do with this is, let's bring the starting intensity down And then we can use CC Composite. What CC Composite is, let's just reset that, is it'll composite what you've done with the original layer without any effects. And so I'm going to turn off RGB only, so that because there's transparency in this layer, we want to be able to show that. So now we can composite the original on top, and it creates kind of this nice little motion blur effect. This does take a lot of rendering power, so the more copies and all this kind of stuff, it starts to slow down. Now I want to do some things here. What if we took this, added some turbulent noise, and then here's this simple stack right here where we shift channels. Let me show you what's going on. Shift channels, take alpha from lightness. Let's remove the color matting and do a simple choke. And then what we've done is created just the white, and the rest is transparent. And then if we echo that, add composite, and then we see there's some noise in that blurring effect. And what we can do is, into this turbulent noise, let's go in here and change the evolution. You can see it's subtle, but there is some like noisiness to the blur. Now we're gonna come into the echo, and let's give it some more numbers, and this is gonna make it extend out further. But it's going to take longer to render. Now one thing you can do is we can go in and add a tint. And if we put that tint above CC Composite, then what we can do is we can come in here and change this white tint to a different color. And then it'll start to change it. Now you can also experiment with where this is stacked, right? If you stack it before some of these other things, it just gives it some different changes. So let's go there at the end. And we've got that nice fiery color. So that is another way of creating a motion blur using the echo effect and then some layer stacks to create this more of an organic looking echo. Now let's go lastly. Remember what we did there with that echo is it will take it and it'll do the same movement but just back in time. So what we have here is the same movement. And what I want to do, I'm going to duplicate that. And let's just highlight this one. Let's go into position, turn off all keyframes. So what we have here is it's not doing anything, right? Like it's just sitting there. So in that position, what I want to do is I'm going to add an expression. And so what I'm going to do is going to pick whip that position of the layer that is moving and add to that dot value at time, and in parentheses put time. And then what happens is it's just following it. You can see that the position is the exact same. Now what if we put in here time minus index? Well, that is too far because it's 1 whole second. So let's go time minus index, and in parentheses we add divided by 100. And you can see now it's starting to move around. That's really cool. Now what I want to do is on here we have a slider control on this control. So let's say divided by slider control, and let's times that by say 10 to give it a little more. And then when we slide this up, it gets more or less, right? And then, since we put in index, what that's doing is it's taking the number of what layer it is. So if I start to just duplicate this a bunch of times, then I come back into this control, and now I have basically created my own echo. But what this allows me to do is I can come in and make changes to all of these individually. So let's bring the opacity down. Or I can come into all of these and change color. Say maybe there's a few of them I want to have a spot different few colors. And this is where we can start to create a really kind of cool custom motion blur that you just can't do any other way. Alright, so that is the last way of creating your own custom rigged up motion blur. I hope you learned some cool stuff and maybe you got some cool ideas from this. I'd love to see it. I want to see what you come up with, so make sure you comment and show me what you got. Thanks. Talk to you next time.